There is a question you still haven't been able to answer in a way that completely satisfies. Not the question about what happened. You already have enough data for that. Not the question about who. You know more than you would like to know. The question that remains, the one that wakes up with you, the one that appears in the interval between one task and another, the one you try to silence with movement, is the oldest and the most difficult. Why did God allow it? Not why the human being acted the way they acted. You have already made peace or are making it with the answer to that. The question that hurts in a different way is, if there was protection, if there was a purpose, if I was on the right path, why did what passed through me pass? Why didn't the covering prevent what it prevented? Why did what was meant to wound me reach as far as it did? This video exists for that question, not with easy answers, because easy answers to this question are a way of disrespecting it, but with the depth it deserves, with the theology that the oldest book in the Bible developed on exactly this theme, and with the distinction that will change the way you read everything you have gone through. Stay until the end, because the last section of this episode will reveal the mechanism by which what was permitted transforms into qualification, and why the version of you that is emerging could only have been produced by what you did not choose to go through. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now, because we are building a language episode by episode, and what comes next will continue to deepen what we started here. Let's start with what science has to say about the question you are carrying. Researchers from UNESP, in an analysis of loss processing and meaning-making in adults over 35, identified what they called a rupture of causal narrative, the specific state that emerges when something negative happens to a person who had an expectation of protection. Not just the pain of the loss itself, but the additional disorientation produced by the breaking of the mental model that said, if I am on the right path, if I am acting with integrity, if there is something greater operating, then things like this should not happen. This model is more prevalent than one might imagine, and its breaking is not just emotionally painful, it is cognitively destabilizing, because it is not just a belief that failed, it is the entire map by which you navigated, and without the map, the same path you knew feels like unknown territory.
Attention, you need to prepare now. I put together an exclusive resource for those who feel set apart for something greater, but live surrounded by noise, distractions, and mental overload. This is a 30-day journey that will transform your life, a guided path to armor your mind and prepare for what's coming, with daily practices of focus, boundaries, and discipline. Stop negotiating with the noise. Learn to spot distractions before they control you and strengthen your mind. Also available in an immersive audio version. Over 10,000 readers have already transformed their lives through the 30-day journey. Thousands of people have already started this transformation. People like you who were tired of living in the fog. Ordinary people who decided to stop accepting mental chaos. Take advantage of this limited time offer only this month. Access your link just below in the pinned comment.
But the research identified something more. The subjects who emerged from this rupture with greater integrity, not just psychological but of character, were not those who found answers that restored the old map. They were those who managed to build a more sophisticated map. A map that accommodated both the reality of protection and the reality of what was permitted to pass through it. A map with more nuance than the previous one, and therefore more precise. This more sophisticated map is what this video wants to help you build. And it begins with a theological distinction that most people have never heard formulated clearly, but which changes everything when it is finally articulated. The difference between what God sends and what God allows. In biblical Hebrew, there is a verb that captures this distinction with disconcerting precision: tzarap, tzaraf. The root of this term comes from ancient metallurgy. It is the process by which the goldsmith places the raw metal in the furnace to separate the pure from the impure. The heat does not create the gold. The gold was already there, mixed with the dross, invisible in the appearance of the raw ore. The tzaraf reveals what was hidden. It does not add value. It exposes the value that already existed, and that the mixture with the impure made invisible. And the biblical text uses this verb specifically to describe what God does with the people he is qualifying for something greater. Isaiah 48 records the divine declaration, "I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction." The furnace was not punishment, it was tzaraf. It was the process of revealing, within what seemed like common ore, what had always been gold. But zaraf has a characteristic that most translations do not capture. The goldsmith who performs the process does not abandon the metal in the furnace. He remains before it. He monitors the temperature. He knows exactly how much heat is necessary to separate the impure without destroying the pure. He removes the metal at the precise moment, not before, which would leave the process incomplete, and not after, which would destroy what was being revealed. The tzaraf is a process controlled by one who knows what he is producing. What passed through you passed within a controlled tzaraf. Not because God sent every detail of what wounded you, but because God established the limits of what could reach you, and what passed through those limits passed because it had a function that the furnace of comfort could not fulfill. Like this video now. Because what I'm going to show about Job in the next sections is the foundation of everything that remains of this episode, and it is the most honest text about this question that exists in all sacred literature. Job was a man described by the text itself with 4 simultaneous attributes: blameless, upright, fearing God, and shunning evil. Not 2 of these attributes, not 3, all 4. And the text adds, "There was no one like him in all the earth." Job's integrity was not ordinary. It was extraordinary, documented, recognized. And then something happened that the book of Job records with a transparency that remains disturbing 2,000 years later. There was a scene in the spiritual courts where Job's life was placed under discussion, not because Job had done wrong, but because the quality of his integrity raised a question that only the process could answer. Was Job's faithfulness genuine, or was it transactional? Would he be who he was without the blessings he received? And God established a limit, a gevel, GBVL in Hebrew, the boundary, the territorial limit that cannot be crossed without permission. The text is explicit. The adversary could touch Job's possessions, but not his person. Later, he could touch his person, but not take his life. The gevel was precise. The tzaraf had defined boundaries. The goldsmith was before the furnace. What passed through Job's gevel was devastating. Loss of children, of possessions, of health, friends who came to console and became accusers, a wife who, at the limit of her own pain, said, "Curse God and die." And Job, the man of 4 attributes, the one like whom there was no equal on earth, sat on the ground among potsherds, scraping his own wounds, without an answer, without an explanation, without the map he had before. And then began what occupies most of the book. Job spoke, not in performative resignation, not in easy praise. He spoke with an honesty that still shocks readers who expect spirituality to produce immediate acquiescence. He questioned the justice of the process. He demanded a hearing. He said he wanted to present his case directly before God. He did not put on a mask of peace he did not feel. He brought what he had. And what the end of the book of Job reveals is what most sermons about Job do not adequately communicate. When God finally answered Job, he did not answer the friends who had offered the theologically correct explanations for why Job was suffering. He answered Job. And he said to the friends that they had not spoken what was right as Job had spoken. Job's turbulent honesty was more accepted than the polished theology of the friends, because Job was in a real relationship with real pain before a real God. The friends were defending a system that protected themselves from the possibility that what happened to Job could happen to them. And the gevel, the limit that had been established, the furnace that had a controlled temperature. This was revealed in the result. Job came out of the process with double what he had entered with. Not restoration, multiplication. Not equivalent compensation, qualification to receive double what the process had revealed. He had the capacity to manage. Researchers from the University of Oxford, in a study on post-traumatic growth and identity transformation in adults, identified that the most determining factor among people who experience events of high adversity and emerge with greater capacity than they had before is not the absence of damage. It is the ability to integrate the event into the identity narrative without it becoming the defining event. In direct language, it is not who suffered less, it is who managed to place the suffering in relation to a larger narrative without reducing their own identity to what happened. Job integrated. Not because he denied the process, but because the process revealed something about the nature of the relationship between him and God that the previous prosperity had not produced. He saw what the friends never saw because they never went into the furnace. And what he saw transformed the relationship from transaction into encounter. Write the word refined here in the comments, because what happened to you was not waste, it was tzaraf, and what the furnace revealed in you is what justifies the multiplication that is coming. Now I need to tell you about a distinction that the book of Isaiah develops with a depth that is at the same time technically precise and emotionally difficult to receive. Isaiah 54 contains one of the most dramatic reversals in prophetic literature. The chapter begins in the territory of abandonment. For a brief moment, I abandoned you. And then it completes. But with great mercy, I will gather you. With a little wrath, I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting love I will have mercy on you. Two things need to be said about this text. The first is that it does not deny the abandonment. It names it. It says, there was a moment, a real period, a real experience of absence that was not an illusion. The biblical text does not ask you to pretend that the furnace did not burn. The second is the proportion, a brief moment of withdrawal, great mercy of gathering, a little wrath, everlasting love. The two parts of the pair are not equivalent, and the text does not pretend they are. The period of tzaraf is real, but its proportion in relation to what comes after is one of brevity against eternity. But here is what matters most for what you are processing. The same chapter, a few verses later, makes a declaration about the tools that were used against you. No weapon forged against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment you shall condemn. The text uses the image of the blacksmith, the same semantic universe as tzaraf, to describe the adversary. And it declares not that the weapons will not be forged. It declares that they will not prosper. The forging happens, the process of building the weapon happens, but the weapon does not reach what was aimed at. This is theologically precise in a way that easy comfort is not. It does not say you will not be attacked. It says the attack will not produce the result the attacker planned. The forge and the prosperity are separate events, and the second does not automatically follow from the first. The Greek of the New Testament has a word for what the tzaraf produces inside the one who goes through the furnace. Thlipsis, thlipsis. Usually translated as tribulation or affliction, the root of this term in classical Greek describes physical pressure, the weight applied to something to extract what is inside. It was used to describe the oil press, the pressure applied to the olive to extract the oil it contained, but which could not be released without the process of pressure. The thlipsis does not create the oil. The olive already had the oil. The thlipsis reveals and releases what was contained but inaccessible without the pressure. And Paul, in the letter to the Romans, makes the explicit connection. Thlipsis produces dokimi, dokaim, proven character, the quality that exists not despite the process of pressure, but as a direct result of it. Dokime is distinct from dokimos, static approval. Dokime is the process that produced the approval. It is the character that was generated by the thlipsis. It is the oil that came out of the press. And Paul places dokime in the sequence that goes from thlipsis to elpis, hope. Not the naive hope that has not been tested, but the hope that survived the thlipsis and therefore does not put to shame, because it was proven in the process. You have dokim, not because you chose to have it, but because the thlipsis that passed through your life produced something that did not exist before it, and that something is what will sustain the weight of what is coming. Activate the bell here on the channel, because in the next episode, I will talk about the specific signs that the tzaraf phase is coming to an end and the multiplication phase is beginning, and about how to recognize these signs without confusing the beginning of fulfillment with total fulfillment. Now I need to tell you about Daniel. Daniel was taken to Babylon as an exile, not as an emissary, not as a volunteer, as part of the spoils of a conquest, a young man torn from his environment, from his family, from his cultural identity, and placed in a process of acculturation designed to erase who he had been and replace it with who the empire wanted him to be. The process of training the youths of the Babylonian court was total. New name, new language, new cuisine, new cosmology. Everything that had been Daniel was, at the end of the process, to be replaced by Belteshazzar, the servant of the empire. The project was identity substitution, not just loyalty substitution, and Daniel did not respond with open confrontation. He did not refuse the entire process with a grand gesture of resistance. He navigated with a wisdom that is, even today, one of the most precise examples of integrity within adverse systems. He identified the point of non-negotiation, the food that would compromise his consecration, and negotiated with intelligence within everything else. He learned the language. He learned the literature. He became more competent in Babylonian wisdom than the Babylonians themselves, without losing what was non-negotiable. And the result was disconcerting for the system that had tried to replace him. At the end of the training process, the king examined all the youths and found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The competence that the exile produced was superior to what the palace had planned to produce. Adversity had generated a qualification that comfort would not have created. Researchers from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in an analysis of identity development in contexts of prolonged cultural adversity, identified what they called a synthesis of adaptive resistance, the process by which people who maintain a non-negotiable core of identity amidst pressures of substitution emerge with greater capacity for navigation in complex environments than people who were never subjected to pressure. The core that resisted the process of substitution generated paradoxically greater sophistication of action, not despite the pressure, but through the need to remain upright within it. Daniel was not despite Babylon. Daniel was qualified by Babylon, because Babylon revealed under pressure what was in Daniel that could not be replaced. And what could not be replaced is what positioned him above all who went through the same process without the same core. The Babylon you went through did the same. The process that tried to replace, diminish, or eliminate what was in you revealed, under pressure, what cannot be touched. And what could not be touched is your qualification. Not despite what happened, by means of what happened. Researchers from USP in the Department of Clinical Psychology published an analysis of the relationship between formative adversity and leadership capacity in adults over 40. The result was consistent with international research. The most predictive variable of sustained leadership capacity, not momentary impact leadership, but real durability in complex contexts, was not academic training, was not the network of relationships, was not the set of technical skills. It was the depth of the processing of adversity. Those who had gone through periods of loss, pressure, or failure and managed to integrate the experience into the identity narrative without fragmenting. This profile was the one that consistently presented the greatest capacity to sustain real leadership in conditions of high complexity. Daniel had this profile, not despite the exile, because of what the exile revealed. Now let me give you the most important distinction between what happened to you and what is frequently said about what happened to you. There is a radical difference between saying, God sent this to hurt you to make you stronger, which is a statement that makes God the direct author of your pain, and saying, God established a gevel, a boundary, and what passed through that boundary passed because it had a function of tzaraf within a process that he monitors as a goldsmith before the furnace. The first statement produces a theology of God that is incompatible with the nature revealed in the biblical text. A God who sends suffering as a pedagogical strategy is a God who uses human suffering as a tool of his convenience. And this does not correspond to what the biblical text reveals about the divine character. The second statement is much more precise and much more difficult to hold, because it says there were limits, that there was control, that the goldsmith was before the furnace, and at the same time, it says the furnace was real, the heat was real, the pain was real. And the function of revealing what was inside was real. Not everything that passed through you was sent, but everything that passed had a limit beyond which it could not go. And what reached you within that limit was sufficient to produce what the process required. neither more nor less. The Book of Job does not resolve the question of pain with an explanation that makes the suffering seem small. It resolves it with an encounter. When God answered Job, he did not answer the questions Job had asked. He answered with presence, with questions that placed Job's suffering within a scale of reality that Job, from within the pain, did not have enough of an angle to see. And Job, after that encounter, did not say, "Now I understand why everything happened." He said, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." What the furnace produced was not an explanation. It was an encounter of a different quality, a direct vision of what before was only hearing. You are not going to come out of this process with all the answers about why, but you are going to come out with something that people who have never been to the furnace do not have. A type of knowledge that only comes from within. A vision that only the angle of the furnace produces. An empathy for what others are going through that you could not have developed from anywhere else. An authority to speak from within the process, not from above it. And it is exactly this authority that what is coming could not use from any other source. Share this video with someone who is inside the furnace and does not yet have language for what they are going through. Because the difference between going through the Zaraf with the right language and going through it without language is the difference between Job, who came out with direct vision and multiplied restoration, and Job's friends, who never went to the furnace and therefore never had anything to say to someone who was inside it. Now let me tell you about what Job's restoration reveals, about what is arriving. The text of Job 42 records 3 elements of restoration that need to be read together to understand its structure. The first is that restoration came after Job prayed for the friends who had accused him. After, not before, Job exercised mercy for those who had failed him in his period of greatest vulnerability. This is not a detail, it is the point. Restoration did not come when Job had suffered sufficiently. It came when Job had grown sufficiently to pray with genuineness for those who did not deserve the prayer. The second is that the restoration was double. God restored double what Job had lost. Not the same thing, double. Not equivalent compensation, multiplication. And this was not random. Double is what Israeli law prescribed as restitution for one who had suffered theft. The text is saying with the legal language of its culture that what passed through Job's Gevel was not off the record. There was an accounting. The third is that the text specifically records that Job's brothers and sisters, those who had not been present during the suffering, came after the restoration, each with a gift, each with words of comfort. What did not appear in the furnace appeared in the result. And Job received both those who had stayed and those who had arrived later, without the text recording bitterness for those who had been absent at the wrong moment. This third part is the quietest test of all, because bitterness toward those who did not show up in the furnace is one of the most efficient mechanisms for interrupting restoration. When you invest energy in the bill that the people who failed you must pay, when your attention goes to what they should have done and did not do, you are placing your growth in a relationship of dependency on their repentance, and their repentance is outside of your control. Job did not do that. He prayed for those who had failed, and restoration came. Researchers from UNESP, in the same study on the rupture of causal narrative, identified that the strongest predictor of sustained well-being after periods of severe adversity was not the external resolution of the conflicts that had caused the adversity. It was what the researchers called well-being decoupling, the person's ability to decouple their own flourishing from the recognition, repentance, or change of those who had contributed to the adversity. In biblical language, Job's restoration did not wait for the friends to repent on their own. It came when Job prayed for them. Job moved. He did not wait for them to move first. This is the movement that the Zaraf produced in Job, and it is the movement that the Zaraf is producing in you, the capacity to not place your advancement in dependency on what others recognize, return, or correct. You are being refined to receive something that the version of you prior to the process could not sustain. Not because the previous version was inadequate, it was the correct version for the previous moment. But what is arriving has weight, and weight requires structure that only the Zaraf produces. The doctor who most helps patients with chronic pain is not the one who never had pain. It is the one who went to the furnace of pain and came out with a type of understanding that theoretical study cannot transfer. The leadership that most sustains people in crisis is not the one that never hit bottom. It is the one that hit bottom and learned what is there, and therefore can guide others with a precision that comes from inside the territory, not from outside it. What the furnace revealed in you is your qualification for what is coming. Not despite what you went through, because of what you went through revealed. In the next episode of this channel, I will enter the territory that comes after the furnace, the signs that the Zaraf phase is coming to an end, what multiplication looks like when it begins to appear, and the specific wisdom to go through the period of honor without losing what was built in the period of refinement. Because honor has its own traps, and those who were not prepared for them lose in the period of multiplication what was built in the period of Zaraf. You were refined. The furnace had boundaries, the goldsmith was before it the entire time, and what came out of the process is gold that the ore from before did not reveal. The double is coming, and now you have the structure to sustain it.
Attention, you need to prepare now. I put together an exclusive resource for those who feel set apart for something greater, but live surrounded by noise, distractions, and mental overload. This is a 30-day journey that will transform your life, a guided path to armor your mind and prepare for what's coming, with daily practices of focus, boundaries, and discipline. Stop negotiating with the noise. Learn to spot distractions before they control you and strengthen your mind. Also available in an immersive audio version. Over 10,000 readers have already transformed their lives through the 30-day journey. Thousands of people have already started this transformation. People like you who were tired of living in the fog, ordinary people who decided to stop accepting mental chaos. Take advantage of this limited time offer only this month. Access your link just below in the pinned comment.